Good afternoon, Brigade, visitors, and distinguished guests. The morning panel was devoted to the issue of whether U.S. and China are caught in a trap of war. Our second panel of the conference considers the complex and competitive challenges China poses to the United States in the political, strategic, and economic domains. Beyond the geopolitical arena, U.S.-China competition is playing out in territorial disputes, trade, economic models, political systems, and even contestation over the international order, the likes of which the world has not seen before. As China's advancement continues at both an impressive and unprecedented rate, the stakes and scale of potential conflict rise. As President Trump's national security strategy and the Pentagon's defense strategy have declared, great power competition has returned. And as a revisionist power, China possesses long-term strategic competition to the United States. In light of this, we must begin to ask, what is the nature of the new China challenge, where the U.S.-China competition is heading, and whether the two great powers can jointly chart a cooperative future. Today's panel will be moderated by Dr. David M. Finkelstein. A graduate from the United States Military Academy at West Point, David M. Finkelstein served as a U.S. Army officer that has held command at the platoon, company, battalion, and major levels. He's also spent time as an advisor in the Pentagon to the Secretary of Defense, as well as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He earned his Ph.D. in Chinese history from Princeton. Currently, David M. Finkelstein is the Vice President and Director of CNA's China Studies Division. His area of expertise is the Chinese and Asian affairs, where he has published multiple works to include From Abandonment to Salvation, Washington's Taiwan Dilemma, co-edited Chinese Leadership in the 21st Century, The Rise of the Fourth Generation, Chinese Warfighting, the PLA Experience since 1949, China's Revolution in Doctrinal Affairs, Recent Trends in the Operational Art of the Chinese People's Liberation Army, and Civil Military Relations in Today's China, Swimming in a New Sea. Today, Dr. Finkelstein will lead our panel in discussion in a conversation that moves beyond the problem of potential conflict and considers the complex and competitive dynamics in the U.S.-China relationship in the political, economic, and strategic domains. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming this afternoon's panel.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Luca, for that very generous introduction, and good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the last panel of what has been a truly remarkable day. You may have noticed I'm a graduate of the United States Military Academy. I'd like to wish happy birthday to brothers and sisters here in Annapolis. So happy birthday to the Naval Academy. Jointness. So we've had a very rich discussion so far, and I have with me a group of specialists who really are a stellar group to address the issues at hand. Collectively, they bring a remarkable amount of expertise to the stage, which is informed by experiences as policymakers and practitioners in government, academics, private sector analysts, and think tankers. They all come with a lot of experience and time dealing with the U.S.-China relationship. But let me briefly introduce them. And I would also say they're all colleagues and friends as well. Michael Green. Michael is Senior Vice President for Asia and Japan Chair at the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington, and also the Director of Asian Studies at the Walsh School at Georgetown University. Many of you may know him, certainly I know him from his time at the White House as Senior Director for Asia on the National Security Council. David Shambaugh, Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at the George Washington University, a highly respected scholar on contemporary Chinese affairs. David is widely published across a remarkable breadth of China-related issues, whether it's the People's Liberation Army, the Chinese Communist Party itself, or even China as a global actor. And he's also the former editor of the very prestigious China Quarterly. Next, Dan Rosen, coming down here from New York, where he's a founding partner of the Rhodium Group. He leads the firm's work on China and the world economy. He previously served as a senior advisor in the White House on the National Economic Council, and he actually played a very key role many years back in completing China's accession to the World Trade Organization. So he has some real practical experience on the geoeconomic dimensions of this relationship. Edmund Feigenbaum, Vice Chairman of the Paulson Institute at the University of Chicago, His experiences are quite diverse as well, spanning academia, government service, think tanks, and the private sector. He served at the State Department for various tenures as a Deputy Assistant Secretary for South Asia, and also a member of the very important policy planning staff at State Maine. And finally, but certainly not least, our colleague and friend Oriana Skylar Mastro. Dr. Mastro is Assistant Professor of Security Studies at Georgetown University, where she focuses on China and East Asia. This year, I believe, Oriana, you're at the American Enterprise Institute finishing up a book on global leadership. And I would also say that Oriana also proudly serves as an officer in the United States Air Force Reserve, so thank you for that. Okay, so I don't know how Admiral Daly does it and how the USNI crew manages to do it, but once again, they've chosen the right conference topic at the right time in history. What a couple of weeks it's been here for those of us who are involved in the U.S.-China relationship or watching it. Trade tariffs, sanctions on the PLA, the cancellation or postponement of planned military engagements, the USS Decatur incident that you heard about on the previous panel in the South China Sea, the president's comments at the UN, followed by the vice president's comments just a few days ago. And that's not even a complete list of everything that's transpired in just the last 10 or 12 days. For those of us who have been involved in the U.S.-China relationship for many years, these are extraordinary times. So before we even begin to try to figure out what this great power competition or this long-term strategic competition is all about, I'd like to ask each of the panelists to give me briefly their take on what is the current state of the U.S. relationship with China. So let's start down at the far end with Evan and just work our way through this.
The current state of the U.S.-China relationship is bad. And I'm laughing because I saw Graham Allison in the hallway, which reminded me years ago when I was at Harvard with Graham, he was interviewing a very prominent Russian politician on stage. And Graham said, "Can you describe the Russian economy in one word?" And the politician said, "Good." So then Graham said, "Okay, how about 2 words?" And he says, "Not good." And that's a little bit about how I feel the state of the relationship. So anyway, it's the pithy assessment, which you will all have deduced, is that it's bad. And I think it's kind of spiraling downhill fairly quickly in a whole bunch of areas. I think from my perspective, the working theory of the case for a lot of people for a long time was that economic integration between these two countries would somehow mitigate security competition. But if anything, it seems to me the reverse is happening. Not only has it not mitigated it, but security competition is beginning to bleed into many areas of economics as well. And what's more, as I'm sure Dan will talk about, there are many aspects of the economic relationship that are at a bit of a breaking point. So, one challenge is to stabilize things. And I don't think anybody has a magic bullet for that right now. But from my perspective, one element of that on the American side is to knock off some of the divorce talk, for which I think there's a consensus among some people. But as somebody who lives outside of Washington, in Chicago, out in the middle of the country, there may be a Washington consensus around some elements of that, but there ain't no American consensus around it. And people don't talk about China that way. And you still have governors chasing China in ways that are not that much different than they were 3-4 years ago. You still have some businesses that are experiencing China in different ways. So I think the challenge is we're not going to get to an equilibrium, but to stabilize things a little bit. And then for the U.S. to figure out what it means to compete with this country. And that's something I know we're going to talk about when we talk about competition, but competing smarter and better, from my perspective, means doing some things a little bit differently than the United States is doing now. So we can come back to that.
Thanks. Oriana?
So to just start with what Evan said about economic integration, to give you a sense of my starting point, 10 years ago I wrote an article in Survival called Economics Can't Save Us, about how economic integration was not going to be sufficient to dampen the conflictive tendencies between our two countries. As someone who focuses on military and security issues, while I would agree that the situation right now between the United States and China is not good, from my perspective, it hasn't changed enormously. The only thing that really has changed in the past couple of years is not so much Chinese behavior, but the United States' recognition of what Chinese behavior is. And so while I think one of the misconceptions that many in the United States had was the United States was trying to convince China they would be better off with the United States in charge. That was an explicit part of the policy as far as I could understand it. And the Chinese government never believed that. Now, in a weaker position, they kind of kept their mouths shut about it for a while, and now that they find themselves with a stronger resource base, they're challenging the United States more. And so from the Chinese perspective, I think you can understand that China is very frustrated with the current downturn in U.S.-China relations, because from their perspective, they're not doing anything differently than they did 5 years ago. What's really different is the United States' focus. For many years, at least in the military and defense field, there was the understanding that the Chinese military was primarily focused on preparing to fight wars against the United States. And so in the context, we'll talk about cooperation and competition, but from my viewpoint, I was always studying the weapon systems, the strategies, the doctrine that very explicitly was about fighting the U.S. And so the two countries already, I think, on that level, had some conflicting interests. And for many years, there was this trope out there that we had tension because of strategic mistrust. But in my view, as someone who studies China, I think China understood us and we understood them. This wasn't a miscommunication or misunderstanding. It was that we fundamentally have this one issue, which is China wants the United States out of Asia, at least militarily, and the United States, hopefully, for now, is dedicated to staying. So from that perspective, I think we're much more frank about the competition. And just to end on a good news note, because I think it could be a lot worse, when I look at the difference between U.S. China and U.S. Soviet Union, for example, there is no animosity between the Chinese people and Americans. I think China has great respect for the United States and vice versa. I have a lot of very close Chinese friends, and the Chinese have a lot of friends in the United States. So I'm really hoping that we keep this competition in the practical, realist sort of realm and don't extend it to the ideological realm.
That's terrific. So that's one little ray of hope that's breaking through the ceiling here. Thanks, Oriana. Michael.
Well, the U.S.-China relationship is clearly one that's defined primarily by competition, rivalry. Vice President Pence made that clear in his speech. It's loud and clear in the national security strategy the White House put out and the national defense strategy that the Pentagon put out. But it didn't come first from the U.S. side, it came first from the Chinese side. If you want to find the first senior leadership level articulation of rivalry and competition, look to China. Xi Jinping's speech in Shanghai in April 2014, where he argued Asians should settle their own security without foreign blocs.
That was the CICA conference.
A conference that Uzbekistan hosted. Right. Xi Jinping headlined it. And it was almost exactly the same language Gorbachev used in the Cold War to try to say the U.S. should get out of Asia. 19th Party Congress, Xi Jinping articulates a vision to 2050 for China, which is clearly based on outcompeting the U.S. Made in China 2025, the high technology and manufacturing strategy clearly meant to dominate technologies that are national security and economic core pillars. So, the spin on the ball, there was competition after the Cold War. I worked in the Pentagon 20 years ago when we built up the U.S.-Japan alliance to deal with China's bracketing of Taiwan with missiles in 1995. I worked in the White House a little over a decade ago when we shored up relations with India. So we've been competing, but the spin on the ball has really picked up. As Oriana said, it's picked up in the U.S. in the last year, but I think the articulation of a zero-sum or something close to a zero-sum relationship came from Xi Jinping, and it came over the last 5 years. Why? Part of it was the financial crisis in 2008 and 9, which made the U.S. and the West look like we were in decline. Part of it was Xi Jinping's own personality. There are other factors, but it has definitely taken a sharp turn for the worse. The only thing I'd end on a slightly positive note is, in public opinion polls, while a majority of Americans say China's an adversary, it's only a narrow majority. And a significant number of Americans, to Evan's point, still see China as a partner, especially if you're a governor or if you're looking for investment or economic opportunities.
Thanks, Michael. David, how do you view the situation?
Well, as you say, David, these are extraordinary times, and the frictions in the relationship are really maybe unprecedented. But I don't think it's an unprecedented low in the relationship. What distinguishes, to my mind, this period and this time from previous lows is that this was not an event-induced deterioration. So just remember other times when the Tiananmen massacre or the Taiwan Straits crisis or the Belgrade bombing or the EP3 incident, that all four of those and other times have sent the relationship into a tailspin. What distinguishes this time is that there's no event that has triggered this, and this is systemic. Right. It's broad, it's across all spheres of the relationship. The deterioration and the frictions are real for real reasons. And we need to recognize those. I credit, in fact, the Trump administration with doing so explicitly in the national security strategy and national military strategy. This is the first American administration ever to call it as it is, to call China a strategic competitor, which they are. So I think this is the new normal. It's structural, it's indefinite. We better get used to it, and we can't kind of work out a roadmap with the Chinese for some kind of return to normalcy, if normalcy is a cooperative relationship. I mean, this is, and we'll get into this in the other questions, it's a mixture of some cooperation and a lot of competition. So the question is, how do you manage the competition? How do you effectively compete? How do you embrace the competition and fashion a truly comprehensive and effective competitive strategy for China? That's what the next step, I think, for the administration is going to be.
And before I ask Dan for his comments, I would say that for many people who are steeped in looking at the U.S.-China relationship, the fact that we're experiencing these problems is not surprising, either for Chinese or Americans. In fact, I think Michael and I were involved in a project with Chinese counterparts a couple of years ago where we took stock of the overall U.S.-China relationship. You know which one I'm talking about. And both Chinese and Americans came to the same conclusions, that we were headed for some trouble down the road for some systemic reasons. Dan, what's your take on this?
Seen through an economic lens, there's some agreement and some different ways of looking at the situation from my friends up here. We have just shifted away from a policy of engagement, which in its current iteration dated back to W. Bush. And it was expressed not just regarding China, but Russia and other transitional powers as well, where the observation was made that there was a sufficiency of systemic change in the right direction, in our direction, happening in those countries, that we should take advantage of that, embrace it, encourage it, promote it, rather than alienate it and cut the legs out from under it. And that was really very effective for a long time. We had an engagement policy here that was contingent. It wasn't naive, it was contingent on structural trends in the right direction, convergent with our norms, playing our game, and that worked really well for a very long time. At some point, hard to pinpoint, over the past maybe 10 years, maybe 5 or 6 years, that convergence, with China in particular, has ceased to be adequate to make me comfortable as an economist, let alone my more security-minded friends, some of them up here, who have to worry about a calculus which isn't measured just on how many presents under the Christmas tree this year, but much bigger things to worry about for holidays to come. And so something did change inside China that was gravitating in a direction compatible with our interests, and more recently, not so. I'll just finish this round with a point of view which is a little idiosyncratic to myself, that what changed here was not that China didn't want to reform anymore. It's that over the past 5 or 6 years, it has tried to make the next round of reform over and over and over again, and because it's trying to make economic reforms without letting go of its authoritarian politics, it's not working. So their stock market reform blew up and cost shareholders $5 trillion. Their attempt to reduce their capital account barrier led to $1.1 trillion of their hard-earned foreign exchange leaving the country in a flight in about 18 months. Attempt to deal with interbank market relationships that have to do with debt inside the country almost caused a seize-up of the sort we had in this country in 2006, which could bring the entire economy to a collapse, really, in short order if it's mishandled. So they keep trying. They're discovering that it's not so easy to have this hybrid market economy with Chinese characteristics. In fact, it's probably impossible. And so what do they do then to both create growth for themselves, without which they look like, an also-ran, not the great aspiring power that they are, without at the same time having to acknowledge that they can't do it with politics as we've come to know it in China. And so that's what we're dealing with here.
Yeah. So, thanks. That's really helpful, and thanks for injecting that economic element into that. We're going to get to that in just a minute in more depth, I hope. So I'll take advantage of the fact that I have so many colleagues here who are smarter than I on this stage to help me get my arms around a question that I've got. We've been using the term long-term competition. We've been talking about great power competition. It's in our strategic documents. It's also in the Chinese strategic documents. They're just not necessarily as public about it. What I want to know is, what does this mean? What is this competition about? What is the nature of the issue here? Is this the Cold War version 2.0, or is this something very different? Mike, can you help us by starting off?
Well, the easy out is to say we don't know exactly what this competition means going forward. For example, I mentioned Made in China 2025, an extremely ambitious mercantilist strategy to dominate technologies, but it's not at all clear that the Chinese can do it, for example. Dan mentioned a lot of the financial frailties. There's an awful lot of chest thumping in the 19th Party Congress, but there's also an awful lot of pitfalls and insecurities at home. So one thing we should be careful about today is a linear trajectory on where this goes in terms of the competition. I do think at a sort of structural level and thinking historically, you are seeing a pattern we have seen before that's familiar. When powers have risen in the last 200 years, whether it's Germany and Central Europe, us in the Western Hemisphere, Japan and Asia, they tend to free ride on the global power because they need the global economic and financial stability. They need sea lane protection, and they're revisionist in their own neighborhood. When we were revisionists, we almost went to war with Britain in 1897, and the British said, not worth it, and sort of acceded to American ascendancy. But China's revisionism, which is regional, at the same time, I think to a significant extent, China's free riding globally. China's revisionism bumps right up against Japan, the first island chain, historic American interests. This is not a sort of an optional region for us. We're a Pacific power.
Right.
And that's really the structural reason, and that's not going away. That is just not going away. So we will have competition, but how much risk China's willing to take, I think is a very open question, and the economy will have a lot to say about it.
So just as an aside, when you talk to Chinese, they really get upset by the fact that our documents refer to them as a revisionist power. And I asked them, why do you get so angry about that? And they say, well, that's what we used to call the Soviets in the late 60s.
Different kind of revisionism.
David, what is this competition about?
Well, it's comprehensive competition in my view. If you use the word strategic, in an audience or amongst people in the military, it tends to be used only to kind of the military domain. I would encourage us to think more broadly and elastically about the term strategic. The Chinese do, by the way. Xi Jinping himself has, I think, 11 categories of national security he gave in his speech. So we too, I think, need to kind of broaden this out just from the military domain. And when I do that, I think it's about, first and foremost, values and political differences.
Okay, this is what's at stake.
That's at the heart of the relationship between our two countries ever since 1949. Different periods in time, both sides have been able to kind of pragmatically find common ground and work together, but the political differences and the values, and I dare say the abuse of human rights inside of China is one of the major elements of the competition. And we shouldn't forget that. Then there's the military balance element of the competition in the Western Pacific, increasingly across the Indo-Pacific, And pretty soon it's going to be on a more global basis. Mike has already mentioned the technology competition. Dan has talked about the economic competition. I would just add two others, regional and global geopolitics. Certainly in Asia, or what's now being called the Indo-Pacific, these two powers are jostling with each other, and we'll get into that subsequently. But increasingly in Latin America, in Africa, Europe, Central Europe, this is a global interaction, you might say, and it is a competition, no doubt about it. Simply the fact that China is there in places where we have had exclusive or predominant presence is a challenge to the United States. Latin America, I would note, is one of those areas. Europe is another, the North Atlantic. So to me, this is across the board, values to military to economics, technology, and so on.
So taking what you just said and recalling what I heard in a previous panel here today, three terms come to mind to potentially characterize this: long-term, multi-domain, and global.
Exactly.
Does that, yeah.
I would, multi-domain, and I would again just emphasize the values element of that.
As part of the multi-domain.
It's a contest of values, and it's a contest of ideologies.
Yeah. Dan, you want to kick in on this one?
Competition at present, it's just a muddy term. It really is. I mean, it is all the things that David mentions and more so. I just caution everybody to be super careful. Don't even bother trying to pin people down what they mean by it. It's just inherently going to mean different things to many different people in different contexts. To an economist, it means something utterly different than to all of you guys. It's just, you want the maximum amount of contestability because it's all about the consumer's interest and welfare, not the producers. And you're supposed to create a system which benefits them and not the companies. In China, that's flipped on its head. You want to make the companies stronger and the consumers come second. So that's one of the contests, systemic contests we have, but it's just going to be impossible to really operationalize it, I think.
Yeah, Oriana, any thoughts on the nature of this competition? Or is this even the right way to talk about this? I just throw that out as a...
So I think that I could write an article on the lies that Americans tell ourselves about the nature of this competition. And the first thing I would say is, we like to say that it's about fundamentally how China behaves, or that they have different values or different political systems. But I often wonder if China, for example, tried to change the international system through legitimate means. For example, if they dominated international institutions and used the rules of those institutions to marginalize the United States and get what they wanted, would the United States be okay with that because the process through which they did it was legitimate? And I come down to the answer of no. And fundamentally, and I'm in this camp, we believe that the international system, how we define it, is defined by the dominance of the United States. It's not just about the international institutions that are in it. And so if China plans on being as powerful or more powerful than the United States, that is inherently a challenge. And that's problematic for China because it doesn't create a situation in which they can obtain their goals and not come into conflict with the United States. And so just to throw out some historical context, many of you have purchased or have read Graham Allison's book on the Thucydides trap, and I read a lot of those case studies very carefully. And I came away with a bit of a different perspective, which is not looking at how many cases between a rising power and great power ended in war, which I think he said was 12 out of 16. But how many times did the rising power succeed, either peacefully or through war? Because we use the Great Britain-U.S. example as something we should aim for, right? It was peaceful. Great Britain peacefully gave up its role to the United States, but I don't see any Americans who think a peaceful transition of power from the United States to China would be a success. And so fundamentally, you ask the question, is this like the Cold War? We're in an unprecedented situation. We're in a situation in which China is a rising power that focused primarily on political and economic power first, and only recently has shifted to building military power. We're in this institutionalized and integrated international system such that we've never had before. The United States is constrained by this system and its values in ways that previous great powers haven't been before. And China is rising in Asia, which is rising as a whole. And so in many cases, I think we can't think of competition in the same way, but we also can't think about the methods to deal with that competition in the same way that we did the Cold War.
Yeah, Evan, I know you must have some views
I'll be
on
the
this.
contrarian.
Yeah,
Okay.
sure.
I guess what I'd say is I agree with you that China's kind of sui generis. So I think we should avoid meta-narratives. Every year is not 1939. Every country that China bullies is not Poland. And we should also strive for precision. So if we're going to call them a revisionist, let's be clear about what we mean by revisionist, because not everybody uses the phrase revisionist in the same way. I think if you read our national documents, the National Security Strategy, the National Defense Strategy, but also if you read what people have said about China, the way the former Secretary of State Rex Tillerson talked about China and Latin America, and with some historical accuracy, but without a hint of irony, warned them to beware the ambitions of imperial powers, right? Or the way the Secretary of the Treasury talks about China's lending practices, almost like it's a rap sheet. I think the danger is that they're a different kind of challenge. They are a revisionist in the literal sense of wanting revisions to the international system. And because they are gaining on the United States in relative terms, as is India, as are other countries that also wish to revise the international system in terms of chairs, shares, structures, and so on. China wants some revisions. But I think in some of what I hear that uses the term revisionist, it's being conflated with revolutionary. I'm not saying anybody on this panel did, but others sometimes do. And I think we run the risk of misstating what China isn't while understating what it actually is. Mm-hmm. And to me, what it isn't is a revolutionary power that seeks to overturn every structure, rule, and process of the international system wholesale. And I know that, I think, because we've had that kind of China before, and not very long ago in the lifetimes of people sitting in this room. Mm-hmm. In the 1960s and 1970s, Mao Zedong's China pursued a foreign policy that was opposed to every major global institution, sought to overturn every major rule, opposed the United States everywhere, sought to wall off China from the flow of goods, capital, people, technology, information, you name it, and that saw anti-capitalist proletarian struggle as the basis of international order. That, my friends, is a revolutionary China. Okay, so China is not a revolutionary power in that sense. But we also run the risk, I think, of understating what it is, and this begins to get to what Oriana said, which is a stakeholder in the literal structural sense of having integrated itself into major institutions and rules. But from my vantage point, a frequently dissatisfied, often ambivalent, and habitually reluctant power within those structures. Okay, so when I went into the Bush administration at the beginning of 2001, which was when Dan and the people that were coming out of the administration just finished the WTO accession process, China was basically completing with its WTO accession its accession to all the major structures of the international system. So the United States had been talking about how we needed to integrate China. That was essentially the rhetoric. But structurally, China was in by the mid-2000s. They were in the UN Security Council, they were in the WTO, they were in every protocol on everything, from ozone depletion to chemical weapons. Mm-hmm. So structurally, they were a stakeholder in the literal sense. But that didn't mean they were satisfied with the rules. It didn't mean they were satisfied with their weight. And so the way they've approached those institutions has been, in the first instance, to seek changes, but in the second, sometimes to try to build alternative rules and alternative structures into the existing architecture. Now, that's a very different kind of challenge than just talking about them like a power that seeks to overturn the system wholesale. And the challenge of strategy, it seems to me, is parsing through that because it's complicated. I mean, David may be right that in region after region, China has a different value set, has a different set of ideas it's promoting. But I spend a lot of time, just take Asia, I spend a lot of time in the 2/3 of Asia, of the Eurasian landmass, where the United States is diplomatically weak and commercially invisible. And in those parts of Asia, China is speaking the language of a lot of these governments. Somebody mentioned Uzbekistan, Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan. I used to be Deputy Assistant Secretary of State for Central Asia. China's speaking the language of the global South. And so the U.S. needs to be careful because while there's a contention over standards and values, some of what we think are standards are not viewed as standards everywhere. And so China's able to compete more effectively because it's speaking a somewhat different language that actually has a surprising amount of attraction for governments that see that. Just take the way we talk about environmental standards. I know lots of governments that when the U.S. talks about environmental standards, they don't think those are standards. They think they are Western NGO preferences.
So that's a
is a challenge for us because we need to be precise about what it is they're trying to revise. And then we need to be careful about how we respond because compete effectively means defining the problem correctly.
That's a good opportunity to move on to another issue. I think David touched on it before. I'm going to ask him to pick up on it again. This idea that this competition is not taking place in a vacuum. It's affecting the region. It's global in nature. David, how is this playing out in the region? You've spent some time in Southeast Asia the last year or so. And Evan, I know you just came back from Singapore also, right? Yeah. So what are you seeing down in the region?
Well, if I could just follow on to Evan for a second before we get to Southeast Asia, I just want to say that competition and revisionism as terms shouldn't be dirty words, or even negative terms. In the economic domain, competition is taken to be natural, desirable. Even in the academic, intellectual domain, the competition of ideas. So just because we call China a competitor and that the United States should fashion a competitive strategy against China, it doesn't mean we're trying to contain China or even confront China. Sometimes there are elements of confrontation that are part of competition, okay? But I just think that we shouldn't give these terms. And revisionism, again, that's not a bad word. The world's constantly evolving. The international order needs revision. We're still operating on a basically 70-year-old structure. The Chinese keep calling for revision. I think there's actually some opportunities there to work with China and a number of other countries in reshaping global institutions. Anyway, that's another subject. Southeast Asia, quickly, I'm writing a book on U.S. China competition in Southeast Asia. It's called Where Great Powers Meet. We're both in the game. The United States needs to get more in the game, however, in Southeast Asia, and I would argue South Asia as well. Our policy has, for far too long, been Northeast Asia heavy and South and Southeast Asia light. It's not to say that Northeast Asia is unimportant, but the Southeast, the Indo-Pacific, as we now call it, is really, I would say, the epicenter of U.S. China competition. That, again, is in the economic domain, and the U.S. has many strengths in the economic domain. We have far more investment than does China in Southeast Asia. My favorite statistic is that the total stock of American FDI in Southeast Asia is greater than China, Japan, and South Korea combined. So China, long story short, when I spend time in research in Southeast Asia, the China factor is overhyped, in the media and in discussions considerably, and the role of the United States is underappreciated. So that becomes a public diplomacy issue. The United States government has got to really up its game in educating Southeast Asians and South Asians about what the U.S. brings to the region and contributes to the region. Last point, my time there this summer and last year, I'm seeing China stepping on the toes of a number of other countries in the region, which makes me sleep well at night, because China is very capable of what I call big power autism. They don't listen very well. They're not terribly aware of local environments. They're on kind of autopilot, and we've seen in Sri Lanka, now in Malaysia, increasingly in Pakistan, even Cambodia, which is the closest thing China has to a client state. China overreaching and being overbearing, and now we're beginning to see pushback from those countries against China. That's an opportunity for the United States, I would say.
Yeah. Dan, did you want to pile in on this one?
On just an observation about the questions hanging over Southeast Asia are kind of equally applicable to every other region of the world right now. Until maybe the past 3 or 4 weeks, the perception was that the game the United States was playing was probably transactional, probably looking for a really big deal as the end game of where we're going vis-a-vis China. In the markets, I can tell you now, people have said, holy crap, the end point is not a deal, it is a delinkage and a separation. That there appears to now to have been strategic decision made in DC, that this is unresolvable, that we're not going to be able to compromise with China, but instead we're going to have to start forcing people to take sides with us, because China's not going to change its stripes, and where it's going is fundamentally incompatible with our existential interests. That is suddenly putting Southeast Asia, not to mention everyone else in the world, who's not already on one side or the other, in a hot seat where they have to decide now whether they're going to be off sides with Washington, which is finally starting to show a little bit of strategic coherence, even if you might not like at all what that strategy looks like here, or be immensely off sides with how Beijing feels about this, obviously. So it's kind of the game, it seems to me, David, has kind of flipped dramatically just in the past month or so. Maybe a few folks had some insight that we were headed here or earlier this year, but it's still relatively new phenomenon. All of a sudden, it's a totally different picture for Southeast Asia.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. Mike, do you want to hang
Yeah,
on
I
to
mean,
that one?
if I could just pick off where Dan left off. I mean, this is just in the last week or two, really, and specifically the new agreement with Canada and Mexico has an agreement, by the way, called the USMC, U.S. Marine Corps, U.S.-Mexico-Canada agreement. It has a provision that says Canada and Mexico can't do a free trade agreement with China, basically, without our permission. That's basically what it says. And so as we negotiate trade agreements with other countries, Europe, Asia, as Dan's point's a really important one. If we start to force countries to choose sides, we may not like the answer. They may not choose, but it is a foolhardy approach. I don't think it's sustainable, by the way. I don't think this is a new trajectory in American foreign policy or trade policy. Now, really quickly on the region, Evan Feigenbaum's right. What China's doing in the UN and the WTO and international institutions is not revisionism in the revolutionary sense. They want more say for their money. And as David points out, bring it on. I think we can play that game. These are institutions we helped to build. There are other like-minded states in them. That doesn't worry me. What worries me is the revisionism that China is undertaking in Asia. From Beijing's perspective, it's not revisionism. China should be the center of Asia. The rest of us, the Japanese Americans, we're the sort of new interlopers. But it is clearly revisionism in the sense that it is designed and articulated as such to go right at the center of American gravity in the region, which is our network of bilateral alliances. And I don't think it's going to work. The major powers in Asia, in polls, Japan, Korea, Australia, and to a lesser extent, but nevertheless the same, India, Indonesia, they much prefer a US-led world order to a Chinese-led order. Mm-hmm. The big and powerful countries don't want to be dominated by China. It's in the recent Pew polls, it's in polls we've done at CSIS, it's very clear. They don't want to have to choose, to the point David and Dan made. They don't want to have to choose, but they don't want to live in a world dominated by China. And you can see it clearly in the national strategic documents of these countries. The Japanese national security strategy a few years ago was premised on competition with China and buttressing US power in Asia. The Australian white paper recently said what's at stake is our way of life, our values, and it was all about buttressing, not confronting China explicitly, but buttressing the US. Even India, with its very strong non-aligned history, signed on to the so-called Quad, a cooperative arrangement among the US, Japan, Australia, and India, with the unmistakable purpose of counterbalancing China. So I think that's why I said earlier, we can't straight line where China's strategy will go, because China made a big move and in many ways got big gains in the last year or two or three on the strategic and geopolitical side. Mm-hmm. But all these other powers get a vote. Mm-hmm. And they're pretty important powers, by the way.
EU
You add
as
them all
well.
up.
Don't forget the EU.
And the EU. You add up US, Japan, Australia, and India's Navy, and that's not a fight the PLA Navy wants to take on. You add up those economies, it's not an economic bloc that the Chinese want to take on. That's why Dan's point is so important, because if we had a better strategy, and Evan made this point, we would be aligning with like-minded states, not beating them over the head as we try to compete with China.
Yeah, Oriana, you want to jump in on this?
I want to bring maybe the United States back into this discussion, because I think a lot of us here on the panel have agreed that explicitly stating we're in a competition with China was a good move, and that the Trump administration is the first administration to do that. And I agreed with that direction. But my biggest critique of the Trump administration is that the policies put forth by the United States, many of them to date, and I think, Mike, you mentioned one of these, makes the United States less competitive. And in many cases, undermines some of the very values that I think makes the United States strong on the international stage. And so, for example, the idea of inclusivity or the United States as a global leader prevents benefits to countries besides itself. This is what I see as a main strength of the U.S. China has yet to articulate a vision of what its strength on the global stage would mean in terms of benefits for other countries. Yet when President Trump went to the United Nations and gave a speech the other day, that speech could have been given by a Chinese leader. It was about how the United States was only going to look out for the United States first, how U.S. sovereignty was the most important thing, and if it hurt other countries, too bad. And so a lot of my concerns about U.S. strategy is not, that we are upfront about the fact that we don't like what China is doing, and that China, indeed, I agree, is being revisionist in the region, especially when it comes to territorial disputes, but that what the current administration is doing is making us less competitive. They need to be expanding the international order to areas, like Evan mentioned, that those standards are not universal. We need to build consensus on a lot of those standards so China can't exploit those gaps. And we need to be able to work with countries that aren't, quote unquote, like-minded states, because the honest truth is that there are many countries that are strategically important, many regions where the United States is absent, like Central Asia, where those governments don't fall in line with U.S. preferences. Now, that doesn't mean we need to go back to a Cold War-style thing where we support governments even if they go against U.S. values. I think U.S. values are important. But we can maintain the U.S. policies to try to promote improvements in good governance while still engaging with those countries to help the U.S. be more competitive vis-a-vis China.
So talking about engagement, despite all the grievances and complaints that, legitimate grievances and complaints that the U.S. has levied about how China goes about doing its business, if you look at the strategic documents, it also indicates that we have not closed the door on cooperation with Beijing either. So that if you look at the national security strategy and the national defense strategy, they both echo the statement that the U.S. will continue, and I'm quoting here, to seek areas of cooperation with competitors, albeit from a position of strength. And in the national defense strategy, there was one sentence that I focused on that sort of jumped off the page at me, and let me read that one back to you. It says, the most far-reaching objective of this defense strategy is to set the military relationship between our two countries, meaning China and the U.S., on a path of transparency and non-aggression. So the question then is, I think it's still possible to cooperate with Beijing. How difficult is that going to be? And where do we really need to cooperate with Beijing because it serves our respective countries' selfish national interest to do so? Yeah, Evan, I'll start with you down there.
Okay, maybe I'd answer that. Can I go back to the region for a second?
Okay, if you have to. All right.
Because I think I'd answer that in two ways. One is taking a look at where China competes and what that means for the United States, and whether it's competing in a way that's at cross purposes with the United, which gets to your question. And then second, about what the United States is not doing that we could be doing that would suggest a less confrontational posture. So on the first, China's a trader, they're a lender, they're a builder, they're an investor in different parts of Asia. So they're not like the Russians in that way. The Russians didn't lend, they didn't build. They didn't do it the same way. So among other things, that means we're not going to write them out of the story of Asia. They're not going anywhere in most of the countries in Asia that I go to. And it seems to me that China has some advantages that the United States doesn't, notwithstanding the advantages that David talked about. Right? So one is geography. China's the only country that is geographically contiguous to every other subregion of Asia. Northeast Asia, Southeast Asia, Central Asia, South Asia. Japan's not, India's not, the United States is not. You want to compete in the infrastructure space, you can't build a bridge from Tajikistan to California. You can build a road from Tajikistan to China, and so on. So they've got geography going for them because they're part of the economic and strategic reality of every region, and particularly the regions where the U.S. is not necessarily as visible. Second, they got economic gravity going for them, and that's particularly acute, not in Southeast Asia for the reasons David said, but in other regions. And third, there's this problem of U.S. invisibility that I was getting at before. And if I think about the Eurasian landmass, all of Central Asia, all of South Asia minus India, and even mainland Southeast Asia minus Vietnam, now even Thailand. When I think Thailand, it's Japan that pops in my head, not the U.S. anymore. So that's a pretty hefty swath of Asia where the U.S. isn't competing at all, diplomatically, commercially, as an investor, and so on. So now to your question, so the U.S. is speaking this language of strategic competition to countries, many of which are deeply ambivalent about the rise of Chinese power. Nobody in Central Asia loves China. But we're speaking the language of strategic competition, and these countries are speaking the language of growth, development, investment, jobs. And the challenge, it seems to me, in many of these instances, is that they're ambivalent about China, but they're not stupid either. And what I hear from a lot of these governments is, you guys didn't pay any attention to us until 2 years ago when you suddenly got worried about strategic competition with China. So the first answer to your question is, in some of these areas, like infrastructure, we don't need common approaches to cooperate. You can have complementary ones. Right. And from the standpoint of these countries, addition and multiplication beat subtraction and division. And so if the U.S. brings something in terms of addition and multiplication, which maybe the BUILD Act will or won't do, maybe some of the things the U.S. wants to do on the investments that will or won't do, that, you don't have to have common approaches, but you can have complementary ones.
That sort of reminds me, I was speaking to a high-level Southeast Asian official who shall go unnamed, and he said to me, Dave, it's really great that the U.S. has all these carrier battle groups out here in Southeast Asia, but you realize, of course, that if you're not here economically, you're not here strategically. So Oriana, could you go on to the cooperation issues?
Yeah, so I think in the military sphere, it's very interesting, recently the Department of Defense submitted their annual report to Congress about the military developments in China. And if you look through that report, the term cooperation and its various derivations are used 3 times more often than competition. And that is in the report that the Department of Defense is giving to Congress. In the context of military diplomacy, military cooperation, I think there are areas, and I think we should keep the focus on trying to cooperate. My main understanding is we want to avoid inadvertent conflict, right? Wars that could have been avoided. That's very different than avoiding war altogether, because I think there are situations under which China could decide to fight a war in the region that could bring in the United States, and they're doing so purposefully. It's not an accident that we happen to all find ourselves in. So we want to cooperate with China and have that transparent and have those channels to avoid the inadvertent conflict. But my main problem, I think, with the cooperation narrative is how it was couched, I think, in the past. And I think this is changing, which is there used to be this belief that if we cooperated with China in certain issue areas, that this would build goodwill, that would somehow spill over and help us in more contentious issues. So if we dealt with transnational issues like diseases or humanitarian aid, disaster relief, and our militaries had this interaction, then maybe we'd be able to talk to them more reasonably about the South China Sea. And I really think at this point, or at least hope, that most of us agree that this type of approach does not work. Also, in terms of issue linkage, the United States for a long time thought if we kind of conceded a little bit in this area, maybe we'll get more cooperation from China in that area. And again, this is not an approach that tends to work with China. So when we're thinking about cooperation, I think we really have to think about specific examples in which the involvement of the Chinese military would help the United States achieve its goals. And so when we talk about policy, there was a lot of discussion about wouldn't it be good if China were more involved? Can't China help us in Afghanistan? Can't China help us in Syria? And there's very little consideration not only for Chinese conflicting interests, differences in preferences and tactics, but also lack of capability that I think actually once China becomes more involved militarily around the globe, will regret the day that we ask them to be more involved and ask them for help, because they might bring more problems than not. So in terms of that cooperative element, I don't mean to suggest that everything is competitive in the military relationship, But we have to think about the here and now. Does this cooperation help us in the short term with a specific issue we're trying to achieve? And if the answer is no, then maybe it's not worthwhile to bring China in.
David, areas of cooperation, then I'll get Mike, then Dan.
Well, they're hard to find, or at least the space of cooperation has shrunk considerably. There are at least some areas even that we did find common ground not so long ago in cooperation, such as climate change or Iran. The Trump administration have moved both of those from the cooperative side of the ledger to what you might call the competitive side of the ledger. There's also, I would distinguish between what you might call positive cooperation and negative cooperation. You can, what I have in mind there in terms of negative cooperation, both sides have interest in maintaining stability and peace in the Taiwan area. Both sides have interest in denuclearizing North Korea, keeping slocks open through the South China Sea and into the Indian Ocean. I mean, those are parallel interests that we have, and we can kind of operate in complementary. I like the distinction between complementary actions as a type of cooperative action. PSI, for example, the Chinese are not a member of the initiative, but de facto they're adhering to it. Counter-piracy operations. I mean, there are things that both countries, believe in their own rights, are in their own interests, and are pursuing individually. That's a kind of complementary cooperation. And the last point I'd make is about interdependence and cooperation. So we have a lot of interdependence between our societies. We have over 400,000 Chinese students in this country right now. That's a kind of cooperation. We have tourism. We have lots of economic exchange. We have, but that's not active government-to-government cooperation. That space has really shrunk. And
do you agree with that, Mike?
No, I think David characterized the trend very well. I mean, I was making a list when I was the senior Asia official on the National Security Council staff 12 years ago. We had a pretty long list of areas we were cooperating with China, and David mentioned a lot of them. Afghanistan, I'd add pandemics, very significant at the time of SARS and avian influenza. Quite good cooperation. And in almost all those categories now, including academic exchange, which we can talk more about, it's a downward trend, which is deeply problematic. But it's not necessarily a secular downward trend. So, for example, I could imagine if we face another major pandemic, the governments know each other well enough to cooperate on data sharing in a way we didn't 15 years ago, for example. I could imagine 5-10 years down the road that China's CPEC, the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor, running through some of the most dangerous places on Earth, the Chinese eyes are bigger than their stomach. Their appetite is too big, and they're going to suddenly own all this infrastructure, and all the debt is going to be a problem for them, and all the security issues. So I could imagine that once again on Afghanistan, for example, and other parts of Central Asia, we may be cooperating more.
When you're doing business in all the world's worst neighborhoods, bad things happen.
That's right, and China's going to face a kind of moral hazard. They're taking on a lot. So I'm not predicting that, but I could see us getting back to cooperation in some of these areas. The big prize, this is a lateral to Dan, the big prize when I was in government, and I think before that in the Clinton administration when Dan was in government, the big prize was, could we cooperate on reform of the Chinese economy? And the trend lines, as Dan started to say, were not bad. When I was in government and into the Obama administration, building on Clinton, there was a sense that with the Trans-Pacific Partnership, with an agreement with Europe, TTIP, and eventually a bilateral investment treaty with China, the overall changes in rulemaking and standards and norms would be used inside China by reformers who wanted to get more growth and efficiency in their economy, and that we would begin to have a productive dialogue with the Chinese about this. And in fact, Governor Zhou of the People's Bank of China and others were quite close to our Treasury Secretary and central bankers thinking through some of these financial and economic reforms that would have opened up the Chinese economy, created fewer barriers, less mercantilism, more trust. It broke down. I thought Dan explained very well partly why, because it didn't go that well for the Chinese. But that's the big prize in terms of cooperation. I don't know if we ever get back to that. I hope we do. It's up, Dan can tell us.
A couple things that I wanted to add to this part of the conversation, but I think I'll just focus on the one, and the one that Mike handed off. I think David, maybe the most important thing in Vice President Pence's speech last Thursday morning was him saying that, acknowledging that China had been imbued by a spirit of reform and opening that was convergent with who we are and our interests. And they didn't do it because we compelled them. They did it because they had come to the conclusion that that was in their interest too. Because we're never going to be able to force China to be something it doesn't want to be. But it's not true that they are inevitably going to be the other, this other thing, right? It is China that is more volatile intellectually, I think, than we are, despite our craziness right now, over in Crazy Town, where most of you guys are living. It is China that is going through these it's like a teenager, really, flipping back and forth between different identities, Deng Xiaoping to some of the stuff more in fashion today. But smartly, Vice President Pence chose to keep in the speech, and there was ample debate about this inside, but keep in the speech this doorway open that says, we hope that China finds its way back to that reform and opening agenda so that we have a shared future. He didn't put it in those terms, but that's what he was saying. Not everybody believes that that is possible. I would add to that part of the discussion that it is super critical that we do leave that door standing there. We don't burn the bridge. We can shut it down to one lane of traffic, but don't burn the bridge or pull up the drawbridge, pick your metaphor, because all is not going swimmingly in China using this alternative model. It is a surprisingly short amount of time. The class applying for admission to this institution presently, by the time they graduate, will probably be looking at a fundamentally different Chinese trajectory than the one we worry about today. And when that happens, if we have a constructive stance, mindset in DC that's open to the possibility that we need to be trying to be helpful once again to lock in those desirable trends, okay, we're going to be where we want to be. If we've shut that door, nailed it closed, we're going to regret it.
Okay, so Michael, then David, who are whispering to me that they have something to add here.
So we're going to answer the morning panel's question about whether confrontation war with China is inevitable. So I'm originally trained as a Japan expert and then did Korea and like Japan spread out across Asia. But if you, and taking on board Evan's important point about being precise about history, and history doesn't repeat, it doesn't even rhyme. However, here's a thought for you. If you ask the question that David first asked us in 1928 about the state of U.S.-Japan relations, a panel like this would have said, pretty good. We have competition, but we have deep financial interdependence, and Japan is converging with our economic model. It's going to go on the gold standard. It's going to open its economy. The Taisho democracy, which there's some reform happening in Japan. Break, Pearl Harbor, 1941. Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Yes, play to the audience, because we didn't build enough aircraft carriers and battleships. It's true. But the more structural reason for that war, I would argue, was economics. And it was that convergence that people pointed to in, say, 1928 ended with the Great Depression, ended with Smoot-Hawley protectionist tariffs by the U.S. that cut Japan's trade with the U.S. by 60%, and ended when the internationalists in Japan's central bank failed because convergence didn't work. And then you had militarism, decoupling of the economies, and if we'd had enough battleships and aircraft carriers, maybe they wouldn't have attacked. But the structural conditions for war were really set, I dare say, largely in Dan's world by economics, which is why we're at such a crucial time right now, and our decisions are going to be important in this.
Okay, David?
So I think this is a really important point. The internal character and trajectory of reform in China since 1978 has always been a really primary variable in the state of U.S.-China relations. When China's been reforming and opening, in their terminology, and this December is actually the 40th anniversary of the reform and opening meeting, the third plenum. The irony is that China is not reforming and it's closing. Yet they're going to have lots of meetings in December celebrating the 40th anniversary of reform and opening. But quite seriously, you can track over the last 40 years the U.S.-China relationship's correlation, if not causation, with China's internal reform or lack of it and opening or lack of it. When there's reform and opening, the U.S. is on board, we're working together, it's collaborative. The Chinese actually have a term for this. They call the fang shou, zhouqi. Opening is fang, shou is closing. Since 1978, there have been about 7 oscillations back and forth. And they usually last about 6, 7 years of opening, followed by 2 years usually of closing, and then they get back to 6 or 7. So it's kind of a 2-step forward, 1-step back pattern. This time around, since 2000, I would argue 2009 is when the closing period started, not 2012 when Xi Jinping became the senior leader. We are now in year 9 of closing. And until China gets back on, if it does get back on this more reformist path, the opportunities for American convergence are not there.
So we would now like to go boldly where no panel today has gone hitherto and open it up to the audience for questions for these terrific panelists. So do we have mics out there? Questions? Oh, excellent. Okay, go ahead.
I'm Harlan Ullman from War College. Thank you, David, for a great panel.
Can you use your command voice, Harlan?
You laid out the contradiction in the national defense strategy, which is actually a follow-on from the Obama administration's 4+1. Our strategy today, in part, calls for the military's ability to deter, and if war comes, if necessary, defeat China. I'd like the panel to comment. What are we deterring China from? And if war comes, how do we defeat it?
So I spend a lot of my time thinking about that question. And the first thing I'll say, as someone at the lower end of the totem pole of power in this system, talking to people higher up, I often ask this question as a China strategist and specialist. When I'm trying to come up with ways to deter China, I want to know what is our ultimate goal. And as far as I can tell, the number one issue in the United States is we don't know. For example, in the South China Sea, are we trying to reverse what they've done? Are we trying to stop them from moving forward more? Are we just trying to prevent them from using what they've already built to declare war? I mean, if you're a China specialist, you really, like myself, you fundamentally believe that perceptions, culture, history matters, right? I wouldn't have spent so much of my life learning Chinese if I didn't think there was something inherently unique about China. And so the first thing I would say is we have to come up with an answer to that question. And I will tell you what my answer is, which is there is no way that we can reverse what they've done. And honestly, deterrence by punishment does not work. And so one of the things that I see stemming from people who perhaps worked on this issue in the Cold War is confidence that if we have strategies that we can just hurt China a lot, right? If we can show China, for example, if you go to take Taiwan, we'll sink your whole navy. If you told Xi Jinping today that he could successfully reunify with Taiwan, I think he would go for it. I don't think he cares what that cost would be. And so people who studied primarily the Soviet Union think more about the costs, but if you want to prevent China from doing something, you have to do deterrence by denial. We have to physically prevent them from being able to accomplish their goals. And my understanding of the current U.S. atmosphere is we are not in a position in which we're willing to do that. So unless you're going to park ships between their islands and the mainland so they can't replenish those or move offensive systems onto them, which Chinese government officials have told me is coming, you're not going to be able to stop them. So then you have to go, and the final point on the deter I'll say is that all of our strategies that we've used to date, a lot of them that stem from the Cold War ineffective because we've done them before. So shows of force, for example, the United States gets upset with China, and so we sail something, close to a certain island, or with North Korea, we'll fly bombers closer to the demarcation line. In the Chinese view, what they've learned is the United States does shows of force when it's not willing to actually do anything. That's how they interpret those, is, I guess what they're going to do is nothing. And so we have to look at path dependency. If this is something we've done before, it's going to have a different meaning. So we have to think about doing new things or different things. And unfortunately, potentially risking conflict if indeed we want to stop China from its expansionist tendencies in the maritime domain.
Michael, you want to throw in on that one?
Well, there's the question of what we do about China's 3 artificial islands, now major PLA Air Force runways. And then there's a question of what we do about China's larger geopolitical aims. And they're related, but they're different. China's larger geopolitical aims, I would argue, and I think there's a lot of evidence for this, and I suggested earlier, is to push the US out of Asia as a major power. From China's perspective, it's restoring the maritime flank, which was the source of 100 years of shame from the Opium Wars through the Japanese invasion and American power. So it's understandable from China's position that they would want to secure their maritime flank. Of course, that includes the first and second island chains, Guam, a major US base and territory, Japan, third largest economy in the world and an ally, Philippines an ally, and so forth, plus access to Australia. So the larger geopolitical aim that we need to frustrate is China's effort to weaken the American presence and the American led alliance system. And so the answer there is alignment. The more we do with Japan, Australia, India, the more we create jointness and interoperability, the more we create a barrier to China's ambitions because of their actions, the more we can dissuade them from that. So I think there's a strategy to be had. We've not done it fully, but I think that's one. Then there's the immediate question of the islands. And I follow this very, very closely. We have a program at CSIS called AMTI where we use commercial imagery and analysis, and we caught the Chinese building these islands before anyone outside of government. We did very little, the US government, and the first islands. But the record's pretty clear. It's not been declassified, but the evidence is pretty clear in the open domain that President Obama, when China was preparing to send barges to a 4th site, Scarborough Shoals, said no. We sent the Stennis, we sent ships, we ratcheted up our risk tolerance, and the Chinese backed off. So I don't think we can conclude from what happened that we cannot deter China from these kinds of actions. We failed 3 times, we succeeded once. So our record isn't great, but we can do it. So we have to think about it in the immediate focus of the islands, and we have to think about the larger geopolitical game. And I think we have lots of things we can do, including, as Oriana said, denial strategies, but I think even more than that.
Dan?
Just through the economic lens, the question of deterrence, right? Economists don't usually talk about deterrence, but in the present moment, we have now, China is not being ambiguous anymore about it. They're saying they have an alternative economic development model they'd like to export to the world, and they're willing to cover the cost of that, to put it out there, to get people to take it up quicker, right? They're offering a lost leader here to the world on their development model. Their biggest global customer for that model so far has been Venezuela. China's going to have to write off $55 billion of loans. Venezuela, if it was trying to learn to do accounting properly in a sustainable way, would take 100 years of every Venezuelan to pay off the debt they've run up in the scope of just about 5 years. So I think we need to deter China and the rest of the world from kidding themselves into believing that a nationalistic, authoritarian political model running a state planning-driven economic system with easy credit and debt is the right developmental path to take. I think we'd relive the 20th century if we did that and have it all compressed into 10 or 15 years' time. And that, from an economic perspective, I find quite frightening that so many of the lessons learned could be forgotten so quickly and overlooked because we want to believe so much that there's this magic bean solution to our developmental challenges.
Are there any midshipmen who would like to pose a question to the panelists? Speak up. I can't see you through the lights here. Any middies out there who want to ask a question?
I guess they're not as brave as Army guys.
I know.
Don't be shy.
I was only kidding when I said I was going to drop them for 50 push-ups. I was only kidding. Other questions from the audience? Oh, yes, sir. Yeah.
Sure. Jonathan Ward. So I wanted to offer a thought sort of about this general question of U.S. objectives and where China's headed. And I think what happens is that 10 years from now, if China really does become the world's top economy in real terms, we begin to enter into a totally different world in which many of our advantages will, be eroded or eliminated. So, at present, they're only 60% of our economy. They have to train their people over here in a variety of sciences, et cetera. They haven't closed these technological gaps yet in reality. And I'm wanting to ask, essentially, how people are thinking about this. To me, this is the essence of it, is, make sure that the United States remains the world's top economy, period. How do we do that? Or is that completely unrealistic?
Panelists, okay.
Big one.
Boy, well, part of the solution here is that we need a peaceful descendancy strategy for ourselves, right? We're still thinking of ourselves in post-World War II terms where we were disproportionate part of the global economy. That's not what success needs to look like or can look like. It's very unnatural. So we need to get accustomed to a more balanced global economy where the U.S. is not so preponderantly superior and dominant in every field. That said, our strength flows from our dynamism, our ability to adapt, admit mistakes, write off errors as they happen, encourage errors. And China's great weakness of the moment, they still consider one of their strengths, that they can report so much stability all the time, and that stability is job one for them, right? But stability means whatever mistakes you're making today, you're going to make tomorrow. You're not going to acknowledge them, deal with them, write them down, and move those assets and people off to something else. So stability as a fetish, not so great. Dynamism and tumult on our side doesn't sound terrific in the first instance, but it's part of our strength from an economic perspective.
So, if I can, I agree with that completely. If you talk, as I do, to CEOs in Japan, Korea, and Australia, their number one target for investment is North America. It's not China. It's North America because of low energy, energy self-sufficiency, dynamism, low unemployment, greenfield investment. China is scaring away investors. I think most of those guys would say they'd rather have the U.S. economy than China's economy. And not just now, but a good 10 years into the future. Now, beyond that, maybe the point is right. But the other point I would make is this. Post-1945, the U.S. was 50% of global GDP, economic output. We're still the dominant power in Asia. We've lost some of the edge. But we kept it for a long time. In 1971, we were 25%, half in relative terms of global GDP. What did? We opened to China. We reset the stage. We played the balance of power game. Now we're below 20% of GDP, but what the U.S. has done well strategically is to play the multipolarity of power in Asia, is to support and align with other powers to maintain a balance of power that gives us influence beyond the absolute or relative size of our economy. And that's part of the answer as well. And there are a lot of countries, important countries like India and Japan, that are, as I said, not eager to be in a Chinese-led system. We have to be subtle, smart. We have to not just think this is all about U.S. China. We have to think about the region as a chessboard. But there are a lot of things we can do in answer to the question about relative economic changes between us and China and how we maintain an edge.
That's very helpful. Evan?
Yeah, I'd say two things. First, structurally, I agree with these guys. I'd rather have our situation than their situation. Because as Dan said, they got a lot of problems. And I think, they've got a social contract that's coming apart in a lot of ways. They have a political contract that's coming apart. There's an economic contract that's being remade in terms of the relationship with state and market and so on. So structurally, I think we have a lot of advantages. But I don't necessarily think that translates automatically into balance of power issues in Asia if we don't adapt, which is part of what we've been talking about.
It's not automatic. That's right.
We have to adapt. And this question of absolute versus relative gains, I think, is the critical one. I mean, U.S. power can increase in absolute terms, but for the reasons Dan said and Mike said, it is going to decline in relative terms. And in Asia, at least, if I were thinking about the balance of power, I see that as much more of a problem on the economic side than on the security side, notwithstanding what David said about U.S. presence. Because on the security side, there's no basis for collective security in the Pacific. Until China and Japan have a French-German moment, what is the basis for collective security? So the U.S. is, and as far as mine eyes can see, going to be a pretty critical security provider for everybody but China, basically. But on the economic side, these relative gains issues matter more. And when I think about U.S. leadership, we were a leader because we were a principal provider of security-related public goods in Asia, alliances, forward-deployed military presence, carrier battle groups. But on the economic side, we were a provider of economic public goods and other benefits too. We were the demand for which a lot of Asian export-led economies powered their way to prosperity, and we were the leader on regional and global trade and investment liberalization. And if you project forward into 2020s, 2030s, we will not be the demand driver in the way that we were in the 1960s, 70s, 80s, which makes it that much more important to provide the other benefits, to be a leader on trade liberalization, on investment liberalization. So what are we doing on TPP? What are we doing on rules? What are we doing on standards? It's unconscionable, in my view, because it's not just a U.S. China game. Other countries get a vote. President Obama, when he talked about TPP, used to say, if we don't make the rules, China will make the rules. Well, guess what? The U.S. pulled out of TPP and China didn't make the rules. 11 other countries got together and decided to make rules. So just because China's not writing the rules doesn't mean the U.S. is so central to the game anymore. So I think, invest in thyself, but also make some of these strategic choices in a way that's more effective, efficient, and better and more competitive than we're making them today. And I worry more about the economics than the security for that reason.
Okay. Yeah. Sir.
Okay. Question, Major Chris Reardon. I'd like to ask the panel, what would you say the national security, strategic benefit is to the defense of Taiwan and also a war in the South China Sea if that were to come to blows? Like, why would it be important for the U.S. to even, fight in that area of the world from a national security perspective?
Well, go ahead. No, go ahead.
So the first thing I will say about Taiwan, I have never had the view that the United States had to defend Taiwan for Taiwan's sake, in that in any situation what's important is to maintain the freedom of Taiwan as is. And that's not a very popular view. I think right now the narrative on Taiwan has changed since Taiwan became a democracy, but historically the United States was thinking about providing Taiwan defense even before it was a democracy. The reason I think it's important to think about Taiwan and also the South China Sea is the situations under which conflict would erupt in those scenarios are ones in which China will have clearly signaled that they are a country that acts in a certain way in which the United States' interests and our own national security is no longer safe. So right now we're having this debate back and forth of can we live in a system in which China is powerful? And some people say yes, some people say no. But if China unprovoked, attacked Taiwan, or if China started to close off the South China Sea and started sinking ships and shooting airplanes out of the air that violated an ATIS or something they declared, I'm less concerned about the rock here and there. I'm more concerned that now we are clear on the type of nation we're dealing with. And that's one that presents not only dangers in the region, but one that fundamentally believes in the use of force to obtain its goals, and that its goals are contrary to the United States, and therefore presents, I would say, a much more existential challenge to the United States. And that's why I think that the United States needs to not only be thinking about defending its traditional alliances, but when we talk about freedom of navigation, no one doubts that the United States can navigate freely because we have the most powerful Navy in the world. The question is, are we willing to protect other countries' abilities to navigate freely? Not just our allies and partners, but are we going to protect Malaysian ships? Are we going to protect Vietnamese ships? I would argue that we should move more in that direction and not just focus on allies and partners for this precise reason, to counter an aggressive China.
Yeah, Mike?
I think that's exactly right. And just to add to Oriana's point, the U.S. lets deterrence fail, doesn't stand by the Taiwan Relations Act. If this happens, lets China use military force to coerce a democratic society that's in the first island chain, that's right off of Japan. The impact goes well beyond Taiwan to our entire alliance system, including Japan. For a very, very long time, the American people have understood that our security is better off when we've got allies, presence, and a defensive line way out there and not in Hawaii. And we would frankly be looking at a defensive line in Hawaii. It would be that bad. And I think the Congress generally understands that. South China Sea, is it worth fighting a war to stop China from building another artificial island? Maybe not. That's a different question. But as I was saying earlier, it is worth taking significant steps at the risk of war to impose a cost on China. for example, with Japan, Australia, and potentially in that scenario, India, China doesn't want to take on the whole world. A lot of what China's been doing in the South China Sea or in the East China Sea is cabbage peeling or salami slicing. It's been just below the threshold of confrontation with the U.S. If we decide that because they've gotten away with that, we can't stop them, it's going to just continue. I think we have to remember China also has a limited tolerance for risk, and they've gotten, they have demonstrated to the region until recently that their tolerance for risk is much higher than ours, and that's a bad situation for us, given our alliance commitments. And so I don't think it's a fight a war over a bunch of rocks in the South China Sea or not. It's this larger question of how do we impose a cost and dissuade and stop China. But in Taiwan, I do think, as Oriana suggested, it's pretty fundamental to the international order and American security. Now, really quickly, because this is the canon I used to have when I was in the White House, the U.S. doesn't have a security commitment to Taiwan. We don't give a green light and a blank check for Taiwan to do whatever it wants, because we don't want Taiwan to provoke China. So it depends. It always depends on the Taiwan scenario. But if you're talking an outright, almost unprovoked, coercive use of military force, it triggers all the things Oriana said.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, gentleman over there who I did call on before. Yes, sir.
No, I appreciate that. Thank you. One of the things that struck me about the Dakota speech was the different interpretations of things like the open door policy during the 19th century, and then also the way reform and opening occurred and how the Chinese view reform and opening. And if you read, say, Jeane's memoirs on reform and opening and how that may have led to or was perceived by members of the elders and the Politburo Standing Committee at the time, and how that might have preceded Tiananmen. You know, the different interpretations of reform and opening are, I think, crucial. And so the Chief POTUS's recommendation that the Chinese go back to reform and opening and how that might be interpreted by the Chinese, it seems to me is something that hasn't been yet discussed. I was wondering if some of the folks here could weigh in on that.
Very briefly, I think the point is extremely well taken, that it means different things when used by different Chinese analysts as well. And so it's very squishy and a little hard to pin down. The vice president didn't rely just on that Chinese phrase. He said, I believe 6 times, free, fair, and reciprocal as the American objectives, which do have reference outside of that speech that he's pointing to. That's a little bit squishy too, I have to say. But there's something that we've defined that we are saying is overlapping, coincident with one version of Chinese reform and opening, what that meant, that they're trying to get to. Now, diplomatically, politically, you don't always want to define everything down to the very last semicolon, because then there's not much room for compromise, right? And so it's important that there's a little bit of tactical ambiguity in those terms too, I would think.
Yeah. David, very quickly, because I think we're just about out of time here.
Well, you know, I thought the vice president's speech was about 90% spot on. The 10% I didn't think was so spot on had to do with the claims of the role of the United States in China's reform and opening, and particularly that ridiculous sentence about we rebuilt China over the last quarter century. Chinese have rebuilt their own country. The United States, European Union, Asian countries, many countries have contributed to that process, but I thought that was an unnecessary part. But I'll just go back to what I said earlier, that when China was reforming, and I'm not just talking about economic reform, but political reform, social reform, cultural reform, internally, there was an alignment with the U.S. China relationship, because that's what the United States has been seeking to promote, I would argue, in China since the 19th century. Call it a missionary complex, some people call it that, but we have been trying to move China, you know, in a more liberal direction across a number of spheres for a very long time. And when China itself is moving in that direction, then we can get on board that train. We can cooperate. We can work together. But this last 9 years, they're moving in just the opposite direction. And when the Chinese, last point, when they use the term reform, Xi Jinping in particular, it's all about economic reform. Now, we haven't seen much economic reform. The Rhodium group, many others with that. But I would just like to say reform is much broader. It's political, cultural, and social as well, not to mention environmental and other areas. So, you know, if China doesn't kind of really shift its meta development model, it's going to be impossible for the United States to work together.
Okay, so we have run the clock. Would you please join me in thanking these terrific panelists for a great hour and a half?
To our afternoon panel, we just heard a terrific discussion of various levels and forms of competition between the U.S. and China, and it's one of the best panels I think we've had in this series. I want to thank especially Daniel Rosen, Dr. Shambaugh, Dr. Finkelstein, Dr. Green, Dr. Mastro, Dr. Feigenbaum for giving your time today, which was extremely important to the success of our event. And I'd also just want to say one more time, we owe them a great debt, and let's give them one more hand. Each of our panel members will get a book, Great Powers, Grand Strategy by Anders Core. And I also wanted today thank the U.S. Naval Academy again for this terrific partnership that we have on this conference, and together with the Political Science Department putting this event on. I also want to thank our audience for staying with us today. It's been a very engaged audience, and appreciate that very much, and hope to have you at future events. I want to once again thank the Wood Foundation for their sponsorship, and remind anybody who came on the shuttle that the last shuttle goes at 3:40 p.m. Thank you. This concludes our event, and we truly appreciate it.